Okay, the next type of rivet we're going to do is a tube rivet. And a tube rivet looks something like this. Okay, so again, two pieces of metal with a hole going through the two pieces and a tube as opposed to a pin. Creates a nice, quite decorative look, okay? And it's actually a little bit easier on the materials that you are binding together because you are not pounding with a hammer as vigorously as you would with a pin rivet. I still maintain that 1.5 mm amount of tube that we need to protrude through each side. Again, this could be done as a single-sided tube where you'd solder the tube to the piece of metal. But in this case, we are going to be flaring both sides just like we did with the simple rivet or the pin rivet. So here's my eyeball measurement of 1.5 mm hanging up over here. I'm going to then just transfer that over to my bench pin and eyeball it, score a line on the other side here where I want to cut that. And I'm actually going to take the tube out and then cut it here. Again, listen for the tone to change whenever you're cutting through any type of material. And just before you cut all the way through, you will hear that pitch drop. And that tells you that you're getting really close to the opposite edge. And then I'm going to file off that burr. And here we have our tube rivet, okay? So a little bit on each side that we are going to then flare open. Okay, so in order to rivet these together with this tube rivet, we're going to use some different tools. We're not going to just come in with the hammer and start tapping this down like we did with the pin rivet. We're not opening up, or we're not spreading the metal like we did with the pin rivet. We're actually going to open up that piece of tube by flaring it open. So we're going to need some punches, and I've got several different types of punch here, from dapping punches to these kind of sharp punches like this. So you can see them here. These are all dapping punches on in this hand, and these are just more like spikes, right, with the pretty sharp tips on them. I usually grind them in different profiles. So we've got something that's, pretty steep profile here, and this is a little bit flatter and not quite as steep. So it sort of depends on the size of the tubing that you're using. But for what we're doing now, we're just going to use this one. This is a pretty steep angle here. The thing that we need to make sure of is that we don't have the tip of this punch bottoming out. If this is bottoming out and going through that piece of tubing and bottoming out on the anvil surface, then you're doing nothing. You're not spreading the tube at all. You're basically just driving a hole in your anvil surface and probably making your punch pretty dull. So just make sure that this isn't going all the way down through the tubing and bottoming out, and of course this one is not. So what we're going to do at this point is drop that down into the tube. We're going to take a hammer and we're just going to give it a tap or two. And that's not going to secure the two pieces of metal together, but it will prevent that tube from falling through the hole because we flared the top edge of this side of the rivet open, so it can't drop through anymore. But if I flip it over, we can see that this would still drop out this side down here if I let it go all the way through. But I'm not going to. I'm going to set it onto the anvil surface this way now. Drop the punch into the hole and give this a tap or two or three. And now, just with those, 4 or 5 or 6 blows, these pieces are locked together. They're never coming apart again. But they're not hammered down so hard that we don't have moving pieces, which we do. These pieces can rotate around that piece of tubing. If that's what you want, if you want moving parts, this is a great way to do it, okay? But if you don't, consider having 2 rivets possibly, or we can try to lock this down a little bit more. So what I would do at this point is this punch, I don't know if it's going to do anything more for me or not, but I can switch over to a punch that has a much less steep profile. This punch was kind of pointed like this. We could switch to one that's much more obtuse and drive that down in there. Or we could move over to a dapping punch like this. These work really well too. These are just the little ball punches that fits in the end out there quite nicely. So I can take this, and a couple of blows on each side will continue to spread that open. Maybe I'll move up to the next size dapping punch up for the last little bit. And then once you really spread that open nicely, you can see how wide those are at this point. Once you get them to this point, you can take, a riveting hammer like this and just lay that rivet down. Don't go crazy at this point though. We don't want to make that so flat that it loses its strength, okay? If I continue wailing on this, I can continue forging out those flanges to the point where they get thinner and thinner and thinner. And eventually they're going to get so thin and so work hardened that they run the risk of cracking and breaking off. So it'll come off like a little donut, and then the rivet is completely useless and the parts will start to fall apart. So this is where we are at this point. We have nice rivets on both sides, and that's how you do a tube rivet. Okay, there it is.